Now that we're done with Total War Attila and all that nonsense for the time being until CA shits out some more cut content, alternatively, maybe some DLC at some point. So now I'm gonna get back to some Warhammer stuff. I'll be dividing this series into 2 episodes per faction. 1 lore episode, which is what this is going to be, and 1 army episode, where I take a look at the faction's units and how they might be implemented in TWW. This will include any heroes, monsters and units that are available to them in the fantasy battle, and also magic, although the magic part will be a lot of speculation as we don't know what kind of magic system they're going to go for, so I'm going to assume a kind of a card-based magic system here, where you have certain spells that have certain effects, and a bit more deeper, complicated magic system than what I think they might be going with, which is essentially just turning them into artillery. But for many factions that rely heavily on magic, that wouldn't really work that well, which is why it's hard to predict whether or not they'll be in the game. But I'll work from the assumption that they will be, and I'll address them in the way I think that they probably should be done to do them justice. So with the preamble out of the way, I'll launch into the first faction on my list here, the Vampire Counts. Now first off, a little bit of backstory. The vampires themselves was created by Queen Nefereta of the Kemrian kingdoms before they turned into undead, mindless beasties, where she created a elixir of life, or more specifically, she discovered the recipe of elixir of life among the possessions of the then defeated priest king Nagash, the world's first human necromancer. She then proceeded to refine the elixir and made her own version of it to create a potion of eternal life and eternal youth, because the original elixir, while it did allow you to live forever, did turn you into a skeleton monstrosity, so not ideal. This new elixir had some unexpected side effects. Queen Nefereta's heart stopped, blood stopped to flow, and all of her vital functions ceased. But she didn't die. She remained conscious. She kept her mind, her senses, and even to some extent her feelings. However, in return she had to feed on mortals. She had to drink their blood to fuel herself. Now, common misconception is that Warhammer Fantasy vampires die if they don't feed. They don't. Blood is not what keeps them alive, blood is what keeps them sentient. If a vampire does not feed, he doesn't die, but he shrivels up to a husk if he goes too long without feeding. First of all, he turns into a wild beast that will basically attack and feed on pretty much anything until he can return to a level of sanity. But if he is prevented from feeding, he will dry up into what appears to be a lifeless husk. He will lose all muscle mass, all motory functions, and his brain will eventually just cease functioning. But he can be revived at any time by feeding him blood, so he's essentially not dead, unless of course you destroy the corpse. Well, corpse, slight misnomer, but yeah, if you destroy this shrinkled old husk of a vampire, he's dead. But not feeding in and of itself is not going to kill him. Some other differences from the classical vampire of the Bram Stoker novels, for example, we will, for the purpose of this lore episode, completely ignore those vampires and use the classical ones as a reference. Sunlight will not kill a Warhammer Fantasy vampire. It can maim him, it can hurt him, but it won't kill him. Some lesser vampires, and with lesser vampires I essentially mean that they're not quite vampires, they haven't been given the full ritual to turn them into vampires. They're more along the lines of highly intelligent zombies than full vampires. They can be killed by sunlight, but the big baddies themselves While it is extremely painful for them to be out and about in sunlight, it won't kill them. Garlic won't do shit to them, they don't give a faintest of craps about that. A wooden stake through the heart will kill them in the same way that not feeding will do. It will essentially cause them to cease functioning until the stake is removed and they are fed blood to recover. This does not necessarily need to be a wooden stake, though. As long as you destroy their heart, they're going to be having a bit of troubles, because without their heart they can no longer pass the blood they drink through their body, which they do require to keep themselves sentient. They do need this blood to be passing to their brain, which is the only thing inside of them which is still technically alive. Other than the obvious, thereby being impaled or destroyed or obliterated by a cannonball, vampires are functionally immortal and massively tougher than a human. If you cut off a vampire's arm, he won't care too much. He can regrow that, they can regenerate. They are also immune to diseases and wasting sicknesses. They do not need to eat except for feeding on the human blood. They don't need to drink except, again, blood. They are also much stronger, much faster, much more agile than any human, and while they are essentially dead, they can build muscle mass. They can become stronger, they can become faster, and most importantly, because they retain their mind, they have an essentially infinite capacity for learning, which is why many vampires are extremely powerful mages. This essentially infinite capacity for learning is also the reason why they can thrive so well within human society. A well-fed vampire is nearly indistinguishable from a human. He might be a little bit paler, but that's about it. If you couldn't tell a well-fed vampire from a normal human by any physical characteristics, even their fangs are capable of being concealed. However, if poorly fed, the vampire's inner beast, so to say, rises to the surface. He will be unable to hide his fangs, he will start growing claws, he will start getting deathly pale, and he will even start to smell as his body starts to slowly rot. If properly fed, they can exist within human society rather easily, and since they do not need to sleep, they can dedicate as much time as needed to their work or studies, which means that they can quite easily infiltrate higher societies in human nations. And while there are vampires that live in the wild, most vampires simply find it easier to coexist with the humans. If you are a vampire in the wild, you are going to have to hunt your food. You are going to have to kill, and by killing, you risk being discovered. And most human nations do not take too kindly to vampires, and have bodies of the government specifically designed to hunt them down and kill them. Now, taking the Empire, as an example, they have the witch hunters. Now, one witch hunter is not much of a threat to a vampire. However, if the vampire comes into a situation where he has to kill a witch hunter, he is in horribly deep shit, because where there is one witch hunter, there will very soon be hundreds of them. And even a vampire is going to have trouble against that kind of numbers. However, living within the bounds of society have many benefits to a vampire. If he can acquire the prominent position of a local noble or a wealthy merchant, for example. If the vampire could acquire a position as a prominent noble or merchant, he acquires money, and there is nothing that cannot be bought for the sufficient amount of money. He could have hired thugs going around conducting his business for him, killing people, stealing bodies, draining them of the blood, and in other ways acquiring blood. And this need not happen in the vampire city. That's the beauty of it. If a man is found bludgeoned in a back alley in an Empire city, most of the authorities are barely going to raise an eyebrow. Murder is quite commonplace. If a body is found drained of blood, with fang marks in his neck, That's gonna cause a stir. So the vampire has much to benefit from having humans do his killing for him. Taking the body to a desolate location, draining it of the blood, and then smuggling either just back into the city or to the city in which the vampire is living. Human nations, being populated by humans, have of course some rather severe problems with corruption. A local guard officer won't be asking too many questions about all of the thick red wine the local noble is drinking, as long as he is paid a handsome sum to look the other way. Further benefits, of course, is the fact that the vampire will have access to halls of learning. He will have access to all of the facilities of a human society. He will have access to plenty of blood, meaning more than enough squishy meatbags walking around. He will have access to libraries, to churches where much of the knowledge is gathered. He will have access to magical teachers. He will have access to scripture. He will have easily access to anything he might need. And he doesn't have to steal it. If a prominent noble wants to read a particular treatise on magic, he doesn't break into the magical library and steal it, he simply walks up to the front desk and asks for it. With all of these benefits, it is little surprise that many vampires in the Warhammer world are actually quite fond of humans. They do not turn evil once they are made into vampires. They are still humans, for good or for bad. They do not lose their human consciousness. Now, of course, being turned into essentially a Superman, vastly faster, stronger, smarter than the average humans, will quickly lead you to develop a fair bit of a superiority complex over them, especially considering you're literally eating them. So while I say that some vampires have developed a certain fondness for humans, I mean that more in the way that a human could care for a calf, or a sheep, or even a pet. After all, human society provides them with endless benefits and easy access to the fluids of life. Now that I've described what a vampire is, I'll talk briefly about the various vampire bloodlines. The vampire bloodlines are divided into the von Carstens, the Lahimians, the Blood Dragons, the Necharchs, and the Strigoi. The first of them, the von Carsteins, are the classical Bram Stoker type vampires that usually mingled quite well with human society. They're also the vampires most oftenly associated with the vampire counts, as the von Carstens held for quite a long time and still technically do hold the Elector Count position of Sylvania within the Empire. One of the most famous vampires of the Warhammer world, Vlad von Carsten, was the head of the family, and at one point almost conquered the Empire during the civil war of the Three Emperors. The von Carsten vampires themselves possess some special powers. They possess far stronger influence over the beasts of the night than the other vampire bloodlines. They can summon bats, wolves, and some of them, the more powerful ones, can even turn into bats or wolves. Adding to this, they are perfectly adequate fighters and perfectly adequate mages. They are the vanilla vampires, so to say. Pretty good at everything, but not exceptional at anything. Next up is the Lahimians. The Lahimians are a primarily female bloodline. They do exist male Lahimians, but whether or not they are official canon is unconfirmed. The main strength of the Lahimians is their unearthly beauty and their ability to entrance men and essentially make them into slaves. Not just men, humans in general, really. They are the direct descendants from Queen Neferata, the one who made the elixir, turning them into vampires to begin with. They are mostly described as a covert type of vampire bloodline. The classical noble vampires that infiltrate human society as nobles or courtesans, that occupy high positions within human society, keeping humans as cats or dogs, as happy pets, living relatively comfortable lives as walking, talking blood vessels. The Bohemians are perhaps the vampire clan that most appreciate human society, as it gives them a soft, warm, cushy place to live in with plenty of blood to drink and very few worries. The Bohemians are very rarely openly aggressive to those around them. They very rarely raise armies of the undead and march off to war, happy and content to live in relative luxury within the bounds of human society. And they are, in fact, highly valued by many in human society for their incredible skills as spies and infiltrators and covert operatives. They're also very keen on living within human society because the other vampires aren't very keen on Bohemians, due to some old grudges and betrayals in the past. So if a Bohemian is discovered, odds are she's not going to have to worry about the witch hunters so much as every other vampire within easy reach. And vampires are dangerous creatures, and they hold a grudge for a very, very long time. So it is in the best interest of the Bohemians to live as humans, obeying our laws and our customs, while still viewing us more or less as tasty steaks. Then there is the complete opposite of this, the Blood Dragons. Now, as the name might suggest, the Blood Dragons are an order of warriors, and very, very, very potent ones at that. They're vampires who've dedicated most of their immortal lifespan to becoming ridiculously good fighters. And the reason for this is that their founder, Abhorast, managed to defeat the curse of the bloodthirst. He managed to overcome his thirst for blood by drinking the blood of a dragon. And by drinking the blood of the dragon, I mean he literally sucked it dry as it was sleeping. And so the rest of the blood dragon vampires, wanting to get rid of the curse, are all training to be able to best the dragon and drink its blood, ridding themselves of their bloodthirst. The blood dragons are perhaps the most human and sympathetic of the vampires. They don't really want to be vampires, they want to get rid of the curse. On the other hand, they're also the most inhuman, as they don't give the faintest of shits about turning other humans into vampires. While other vampires see the turning of a human as a almost sacred action, something that requires great forethought and planning. As the bloodline gets weaker and weaker, the more vampires are added to it. The blood dragons view it more as a way of recruiting rather than weakening the bloodlines. They see it as, if one blood dragon vampire can't beat a dragon, maybe 50 can. Maybe 50 of them can get rid of the curse. Who knows? They haven't really tried it that often. Additionally, they're a bit anal retentive about what they feed on, so they're not much of a threat to the average farmer, as they really only want to be feeding on strong, worthy opponents. Blood Dragon, unless extremely desperate, is not going to just attack some human hamlet, kill half the inhabitants and feast on their fleshy parts. He will be seeking out champions, knights, or at the very least soldiers to feed on, which means they're one of the less chaotic vampires, and pose a reasonably small threat to human society as long as they don't have some sort of goal that requires them to brutally butcher people, in which case they're pretty problematic, because while a normal vampire is pretty damn good at fighting, a blood dragon can probably take on a dozen vampires. To put that into perspective, a normal vampire can probably take on a couple hundred humans, so yeah, dangerous. And then on to someone who are most definitely a threat to human society, the Nechrachs. The Nechrachs are sorcerers. They are very distinct in their appearance. You can easily tell a Nechrach from a human. They are shriveled up, ancient-looking beings. Not very good at fighting, but incredibly potent in magic, and not very good at fighting, as in vampire standards, he'll still tear a human apart. And because of their appearance as ancient wizened mummies, they usually disdain human society, preferring to hang around in abandoned ruins and the outskirts of human society. They are also quite resistant to the bloodthirst and don't have to feed nearly as much as most vampires. The reason, though, why they are such a massive threat to humanity is that the Necrarch's ultimate goal is to create a spell capable of wiping out all life on the planet, turning them into undead. They essentially want to wipe out every living creature on the planet, flowers, humans, sheep, frogs, you name it, and turn them into undead servants. And seeing as they have infinite time to discover this spell, odds are, sooner or later, unless wiped out, they're going to find it. We'll finish up the Bloodlines with the Strigoi. The Strigoi are horribly bestial mutated vampires that have been turned into literal monsters, while the Necrarchs might, at a pinch, be able to integrate themselves into human society to some level. The Strigoi is a giant, bulging monster of a creature that would never ever pass for a human or anything even vaguely humanoid, in fact. They are closer to ghouls than traditional vampires, and rather than merely drink their prey's blood, they usually just eat them. And they're not picky on their diet, they'll pretty much eat anything that gets in their way, be it dead or living. They will actually eat other vampires, which is why they are feared and hated by pretty much all the vampire clans that have pretty much hunted them to extinction. Being massive mutated monsters though, they are ridiculously strong, fast and ferocious, to the point where most vampires don't actually want to be fighting one. The easiest way to get rid of a Strigoi is not to go kill it, but to send it off to some other vampire's territory, and try to have him deal with it. And, not being particularly intelligent, the Strigoi do not need much fooling. In tabletop, all of these vampire bloodlines are playable. You can play them as heroes, leading your armies, and you can even tailor entire armies around them. I'll touch upon that in the army video, but for now, we will move on to the last part of the vampire lore. Now that I have described the vampire themselves and given you some history, I'll explain why they're an army, so to say. Vampires, by their very nature, are pretty damn rare. The reason to this is that the way of creating new vampires, a ritual known as the Blood Kiss, which can vary from vampire to vampire, dilutes the bloodline, so that every vampire created is much weaker than the vampire that came before it, and as such, they are naturally very small in numbers. However, due to their magical prowess and the fact that they have essentially infinite time to study, they are pretty good mages, and those that aren't good mages can usually bully some humans into being the mages for them, in this case, necromancers. When a vampire goes to war, they raise armies of the undead to fight for them, and have at several points come dangerously close to toppling some major human nations like the Empire and Bretonnia. And, being essentially human in mind, they can be motivated by anything so petty as wealth or power to such a grandiose thing as justice. Ridiculous as it may sound, some vampires have even gone to war over concepts like love, which you would consider fairly foreign, an idea to an undead monstrosity, but like I said, they are essentially humans, for better or for worse. Most Vampire Count armies are located in or around the Empire or Bretonnia, simply because they are quite reliant upon the local infrastructure to live as vampires. Most vampires do not want to live out in the countryside, being hunted by all manners of witch hunters and beasts and wandering strigoi, or even their own kind out for a bit of sport. Though there are cases of vampires going further abroad. The batshit insane vampire Lord Harken, for example, has a pirate fleet of undead pirates sailing the coasts of Lustria, because why the hell not? It sounds cool. And they could do it, seeing as a potent enough necromancer can raise pretty much anything, be they lizardmen, skaven, humans, or orcs. To conclude, Warhammer Fantasy vampires are utter and complete badasses. They are the highly intelligent monsters of the night of old vampire mythos, not the those things we have come to associate with vampires recently, and are an excellent faction to play for most people who just like cool units, cool characters, and awesomely powerful individual characters. I hope this little lore episode has been informative to you. I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.